I have it on. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. Thanks to everyone for coming out. I'm coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And sorry about that. It takes me a second to get some of this tech stuff set up. So I thought we have a guest tonight to talk about Canada's role in China. But before that, I thought I would talk about a few elements of Canadian foreign policy that are developments over the past few days. First thing I thought I'd talk about is the rally yesterday in Toronto, or Saturday in Toronto, for the MEK, which was a banned organization in Canada until not that many years ago. It's a group that supported Iran. It's supposedly an Iranian organization. Supported Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And it's accused to have been funded by the Saudis and has apparently been involved in assisting Mossad with assassinations inside Iran. And at the rally in Toronto, there was, I think, 4 or 5 MPs, federal MPs. There was John Baird, Canada's former foreign minister, and a number of senators. So this is an organization that a number of years ago, it was on both the Canadian and the U.S. Terror lists, and some of the Israel lobby people like Erwin Kotler, Alan Dershowitz, and stuff like that were part of the campaign to have it removed from the U.S. list, which paved the way for it to be removed from the Canadian list. And but I think this is where the whole sort of Iran protest kind of target Iran, sanctions, et cetera, has gone, where now the MEK is sort of viewed as this sort of reasonable group, even though it was very much considered quite cult-like in the past. The of course also should say that the Israelis blew up factory there a few days ago. That's now been confirmed that Israel was behind that blowing up of a factory, apparently producing arms in Iran. So the destabilization campaign is definitely continuing, and this meeting in Toronto on Saturday, I think, should be viewed in somewhat in that optic. Yesterday, it was reported that a Canadian CP-140 Aurora long-range patrol aircraft, basically a spying plane, a military spying plane, was hovering over Haiti to help in the campaign against the gangs in that country, particularly in Port-au-Prince. I don't know, the fact that it was announced means, of course, the government wanted us to know about it. They could easily have sent the plane and not told the public, which I assume they've done many times before. But they didn't, or they did announce it. So they presumably wanted us to know about it. What the exact objective was, I really don't know, but it's part of this continued deep Canadian implication in Haiti. Today, the High Transition Council, which was this sort of body set up with Ariel Henry, the appointed leader, has set up. It's trying to give a kind of a fig leaf for a broader representation beyond his very unpopular, unconstitutional rule. began. It has some representatives, some different elements of civil society. Clearly, the Canadian government, U.S. government are behind this plan, and it sort of provides some legitimacy towards elections at some point, but it doesn't replace Ariel Henry. So the basic power structure continues. Also, a couple of days ago, Jamaica said that they were prepared to send troops to Haiti, which is interesting. So that's really, it's continuing. This foreign military intervention continues to be sort of floating around out there. I wanted to talk a little bit about some kind of wild backlash to some challenging of the NATO proxy war that's taking place on Canadian campuses. I mentioned when Tamara was on last week, we talked a little bit about the backlash to the event we did at Carleton that was titled "The Path to Peace in Ukraine," and that backlash has actually heightened with the CBC Ottawa publishing a story talking about apparently all kinds of anti-Ukrainian hate at the university at Carleton in Ottawa. And in that article, it mentions our talk as sort of like a contributing factor to the hate going on the campus. And that's what the group, student club, Ukrainian student club at Carleton, tried to get our event blocked, and then put out a statement basically associating this event with what they alleged to be these sort of like anti-Ukrainian acts that have taken place on campus. I have no idea if any of these acts they claim took place, but even if they did, relatively innocuous kind of stuff. And but they're trying to sort of basically blend that anyone who's dissenting from the Canadian government line is engaged in anti-Ukrainian hate, which of course this isn't something we've seen. This is right out of the Zionist playbook. But so the Carleton incident got a story in the Ottawa CBC, but out west in Victoria, it's actually kind of remarkable. There's a whole series of stories. The CTV, the Victoria Times Colonist, the Czech News, the Times of Higher Education, all these stories about this alleged like increase of anti-Ukrainian hate or harassment at the University of Victoria. And what it basically all boils down to is they claim that the Young Communist League at the University of Victoria, which is relatively active. I did my event when I was out there in Victoria. They co-sponsored one of the events I did at the campus 2 or 3 months ago. And they're basically, it's a political disagreement over what's going on in Ukraine and Canada's role and what to do about it. And the Ukrainian student group is trying to frame it as this like they're being oppressed. There's hate attacks against them, and it's gotten a whole lot of attention. And it speaks to just sort of the ridiculousness of the political climate, where first of all, if you think about it, if you know a bit of the history, Ukrainians were interned in camps in Canada. There's actually quite a long history of anti-Ukrainian racism in this country. Probably there's never been a time, almost certainly there's never been a time in Canadian history where there's sort of more pro-Ukrainian sentiment than there is today. So the idea that Ukrainian students are sort of being, harassed and hated on at university campuses is pretty hard to believe. And but yet they've chosen this tactic as a way to shut down. The dominant media is completely excludes differing perspectives, and there's little space on university campuses for these discussions. And I guess they want to make sure that even that small amount of space is shuttered. And so they're framing this as a sort of a human rights. Their human rights are being violated. And a couple other things I wanted to talk about on Russia, because there is a lot of troubling developments on that front and continuing. National posted this article 5 or 6 days ago about Canada's role in pushing the envelope in not just sanctioning Russian assets, but then actually acquiring those assets and potentially giving them over to Ukraine. And it was a story about a conference that dealt with the Canadian legislation, and I think in Russia, I believe, and how this is sort of a model that other European, other NATO countries may be pursuing, and that's this is a real escalation, of course, in terms of the economic campaign. You can have a certain degree of sympathy for the fact that Ukraine is, so much Ukraine infrastructure is being destroyed, and there's clearly going to be need for resources to repair that and to rebuild and all that stuff. Whether this business of taking Russian assets and giving that to Ukraine, the effects that's going to have more generally is I think an interesting question. But sorry, yeah, okay. So there was sharing of screens going on, and so there's some interesting dynamics of how that's gonna play out. The CBC published an article earlier today about Canadians or people living in Canada who have been affected by the sanctions campaign, and how people who had some money in Russian banks or banks in Kazakhstan can't get access to that money because they've gotten caught up in all the sanctions stuff. And they say that Global Affairs apparently has a backlog of 500 individuals who've been, had this once. The one they go into is had about $100,000. They'd moved from Russia a couple years ago, and they had $100,000 still in a Russian bank, and how that's basically been blocked. So there is some broader implications of the sanctions, the asset seizures and the sanctions, more generally impacting on Canadians, which is some interesting stuff. Yesterday or the day before, the U.S. announced another $2.2 billion or something like that arms package to Ukraine, which includes ground launch small diameter bombs, which apparently can go 94 miles, but 150 kilometers, which is twice the range of the HIMARS, the rockets they have using on the HIMARS, which is also provided by the U.S. So that's a fairly substantive escalation that hasn't got that much attention. And clearly, each escalation on the added weaponry from the U.S. or NATO countries, without Russia responding in a way that's sort of viewed as decisive, as putting down its red line, what that does is it basically incentivizes further escalation, and it puts the Russians in the position of escalating in response. And then if they don't escalate in response, then why not send the F-16, right? Why not move from the tanks to the F-16 if there isn't that response from the Russian military? And that's what you see that with a lot of commentators who are saying that, well, Russia's been making all these threats and they haven't really come through, so we shouldn't be worried about going one step further with more aggressive weaponry. Well, eventually, of course, that may lead to the Russian response. Who knows? Maybe hitting something in Poland or blowing up an American satellite or something to that effect, which would then, of course, potentially to further escalation. Yesterday on Twitter, the and it's been picked up, I think, by a number of media outlets now, many left-wing media outlets, the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has this long interview about his role in the diplomatic negotiations early in the first few weeks of the after the Russian invasion. And Bennett, I'm sure some of you have seen articles about this or maybe watched some of the clip. Bennett talks about a whole bunch of things in this, and where he basically says he was deeply involved in these negotiations. I think he says something like there were like 17 or 18 rounds of, and both Ukraine and Russia were on the cusp of agreeing. He put it at more than 50%, and then the U.S. kiboshed it. And he says that basically almost directly. And he was, of course, working. He says, he was working the agreements that, he's working with the French and the Germans and the Americans in this sort of shuttle diplomacy. He went to Moscow quietly, so it's just this further confirmation of what was already been reported in a number of places, which was that basically there was a couple of weeks in, there was an agreement ready to be implemented, nearly signed, ready to be implemented. And Boris Johnson, of course, was a lead player, but also the Americans kiboshed that because they wanted, according to the Israeli prime minister, they wanted to hit Putin. That's his words. Of course, it's possible that Bennett is lying. That is possible. What his self-interest in doing so is really hard to imagine in this case. And so all these people out there who are claim that the U.S. is just, this is about Ukrainian sovereignty and the U.S. has to respect Ukrainian sovereignty of sending more and more weapons. The U.S. has undermined Ukrainian sovereignty endlessly. They've undermined peace negotiations because they want this to keep going. It just further puts the absurdity of all this kind of talk out there that is the dominant talk, unfortunately. And these recent revelations will probably chip away a little bit at some of that, but overwhelmingly that line is gonna continue. There's quite a good article, and Bennett also says the main issue for him is that it's NATO expansion. From the Russian perspective, Bennett says the main issue is NATO expansion. And Branko Mercitek, who writes for Jacobin, has this big, long article titled, on ZNet, it's titled, "Diplomatic Cables Prove Top US Officials Knew They Were Crossing Russia's Red Lines on NATO Expansion." And it goes through just like years and years and example after example after example of the warnings that American officials made privately on this. So they knew exactly what was going on. They knew the likely result. And this is of course stuff we know, and he just brings it together all in quite a powerful article. Shifting gears to the NDP and specifically Heather McPherson. Heather McPherson is obviously NDP foreign critic. She has a clip out of her speaking in the House of Commons, complaining about not more aggressive Canadian sanctions, that they're not more successful. She also has a very revealing tweet around refugees. And the tweet is, it says, Iranians, Afghans, Hong Kongers, and Ukrainians are just some of the individuals left waiting, sometimes for years, for the government to process their immigration applications. People's lives are on the line. And what's interesting about this tweet, and I think it's a window into her worldview, is that all four of the listed refugee applicants are from targeted U.S. empire targeted countries. So Iranians, Hong Kongers, and Ukrainians, that they fit within the U.S. geopolitical. And then the Afghans is also that through a slightly different lens, in that it's those who were allied with the U.S. NATO forces in Afghanistan. So like the Haitians who are fleeing, Canadian US policy, that's left out. The Central Americans who've been fleeing US, Canadian mining policy, that's left out. And the examples that she comes up with, even when she's talking about refugees, the examples she comes up with reinforce the US empire's sort of geopolitical kind of narrative, which I think is quite revealing. I'm sure it wasn't even conscious on her part. But that's just where her head is at. And there's an interesting interview with her done by Alberta podcast I listened to a few days ago. And McPherson comes out, apparently she worked for the Alberta Council of Global Cooperation, which is the NGO lobby group, part of what was used to be called the Canadian Council of International Cooperation. And now I believe it's called Canada Council for Global Cooperation. Anyways, it's the NGO, establishment NGO umbrella group. But actually, if you look at its history, it was funded by the Canadian Aid Agency, CEDA. But it sort of does lobbying for the NGO world. And today, the NDP put out a statement on International Development Week. And I haven't really got into it, I don't think, in any of these sessions, but I'm really critical, of course, of the NGO kind of world and the Canadian government-funded NGO. And I do want to have a proper, thorough kind of discussion of Canadian historic aid policy and NGOs in a later date. But so that's where McPherson comes out of. I didn't know that. To me, that's somewhat telling. And today, she put out a statement on International Development Week. And what's fascinating to get us into the China discussion is that she talks about the UN development goals and this and stuff. Well, the reality is that almost 3/4 of those who've been brought out of extreme poverty in the past multiple decades is in China. So if you were serious about the sort of development kind of goals, China is the big success. Now, that's not to say that I support someone that needs to support every element of the Chinese government to point out that fact, but that is the reality, that something like 800 million Chinese have come out of extreme poverty over the past 40 years, which is something like 3/4 of those in the world that have done so. And but yet, when somebody who's a big proponent of this development, like McPherson, she would never dare point out the number of people who've come out of poverty in China. And so I think it's important to point out that sort of the contradiction and the sort of hypocrisy, really, of saying you're all about development and these NGOs, and that they would never mention the Chinese model as a development model to lessen extreme poverty. So before getting to our guest this evening, I just wanted to give a little bit of a run into it and an article I'm writing partly in response to a podcast on Canadaland. So Canadaland, which is this media critic, kind of like criticizes the sort of left end. It kind of represents sort of the left end of the CBC in its criticism of the sort of media world. They did a podcast titled "Big Trouble with Meddling China," and the write-up says the Chinese state. They published this through release this a couple of days ago. The Chinese state has infiltrated Canadian democracy at all levels, according to a bombshell report from investigative reporter Sam Cooper of Global News. And I don't believe. I think that the allegations in this podcast of Chinese interference are wildly exaggerated. They turn like the Confucius Institute's language classes into some big nefarious thing, whereas the l'Institut Français or the German Gauth, or however you pronounce it, Institute, their language classes are not viewed as this sort of like, big plot from Germany or Paris, right? In all the cases, it is a form of soft power by the Chinese government, German government, the French government, whatever. But I don't buy the I mean, obviously, the Chinese government wants to have influence in Canada. I mean, that goes without saying. Why wouldn't they want to have influence in Canada? And they do, in different ways, try to have influence in Canada. That also, makes complete sense. But the to have that discussion of this alleged Chinese influence outside of the context of what is really pushing the sort of panic about Chinese influence, which is the influence of another country in Canada who has a lot more influence than China, which is the U.S. empire, of course, is startling. And so, in this article I'm writing, in the last handful of days, last week or so, the Globe and Mail did 2 front-page stories about Canadian scientists having connections with Chinese scientists who have connections to China's National University of Defense Technology. And the government has announced, the Liberals have announced they're going to move against this and try to stop this. Well, the Globe and Mail reports that their data for these claims, and basically they're prodding the Canadian government to follow the U.S., what the U.S. did a handful of years ago around scientists having connections to this Chinese university. They say, the Globe and Mail says that the data for this comes from Strider Technologies. So immediately I punch in Strider Technologies, I've never heard of, and I punch in CIA. And of course, Strider Technologies has a whole bunch of top former CIA officials on its board and its top positions. So when we talk about foreign intervention in Canada, this private organization that's headed by a bunch of CIA people in the U.S. getting the Globe and Mail to put this on the front page to kibosh relations between Canadian and Chinese scientists, that's a form of interference in Canada. That's fairly, it was very effective. But the Globe and Mail, of course, doesn't mention that the CIA connection. Similarly, there was a House of Commons resolution passed, I think, on Thursday or Friday that reiterates that China is committing genocide in Xinjiang and calls for 10,000 Uyghur refugees to be brought into Canada. Well, it's Samir Zuberi, who is actually an old friend of mine, who was in the Concordia Student Union with. He's the one that's been pushing this, working hand in hand with Tati, with the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project. The Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project stated openly, now they seem to have taken it off their website, but for over a year, they stated openly that they're funded by the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy, which was does the work the CIA used to do, funded by the American government for its advocacy in Canada to target the Canadian Parliament. And they were the group that got the initial genocide resolution on Xinjiang that Parliament passed a couple of years ago. So talk about a flagrant example of U.S. intervention in Canada around China. Or take the spy balloon kerfuffle. The Pentagon blew this up. The spy balloon apparently flew through Canadian airspace the last days of January. The Pentagon blew the whole thing up, probably to sort of sabotage the visit by Blinken to China and the fact that President Xi was supposed to meet with Blinken. And they blew this whole thing up. And then you have Canada summoning the Chinese ambassador. You have Melanie Joly talking about the danger to Canadians of the spy balloon, and Trudeau then boasting, then applauding the Americans blowing up the balloon. Again, U.S. example of the assertion of U.S. influence within Canadian political life, far, 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 far greater than any influence China has in Canada. So you can't have a conversation about Chinese influence in Canada like the Canadaland had, a 45 minute talk about this issue, without mentioning how the U.S. empire is playing up this whole angle of Chinese interference. And in fact, often it's U.S. interference, U.S. funded groups that are the ones directly pushing against this alleged Chinese interference, including the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's disinformation project. Again, its disinformation project stated openly was funded by the State Department, funded by the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. So this is, I think, some of the context that is important to have in a discussion about Canada China, and I now introduce our speaker, William Dere. I'm having a difficulty. William, are you there? Oh, yes, I see you now there. Sorry.
Yes, I'm here. I just turned my mic on.
Oh, that's spotlight. So you've, of course, been following Canada-China relations and been very active in the Chinese-Canadian community for decades. And I thought we had you on a few months ago, early in the Canadian Foreign Policy Hours history. And I thought that with what we're seeing today, it's important to have this conversation, go deeper into this conversation of Canada-China relations, because I do think this whole spy balloon thing or weather balloon or whatever is a really, kind of shocking, the amount of hysteria whipped up around it. And I think that we're seeing that increasingly the Canadian government is completely joining this drive for at minimum economic war and at maximum full-fledged war. And so I think, just to start off, what do you make of the whole spy balloon gate, Canada summoning the Chinese ambassador, etc.?
Well, originally I could only laugh at the situation. It's a bit of a farce, but seriously, it is a very serious situation, because this incident shows how the U.S. and the Canadian governments are overreacting to and it could be an innocent thing like a weather balloon, but it falls into their amplify war propaganda that have been launched by both the Canadian and the U.S. governments and the media. The media who are cheerleaders of the Canadian and American foreign policy. So what they're trying to do is to scare the general population, to encourage a warlike mentality against China, but also, more importantly, for the military-industrial complex, is to allow more spending to buy more armaments, to arm themselves, to arm Ukraine, to arm Taiwan, to arm everybody else, so they can surround Russia and China, and because they see both Russia and China as their principal enemies in the world today. But I think we can all agree that that all countries spy on each other one way or the other. China has a very sophisticated space station, and they can just aim their instruments on the U.S. mainland or the Canadian mainland, and they can see whatever they want to see. They have spy satellites, and of course, they even have TikTok. So there you go. What can you say about that? But at the same time, the Americans and the Canadians routinely send spy planes over to China. About 20 years ago, there was an incident where a U.S. spy plane was forced to land on Hainan Island on the south coast of China because it was caught spying, and there was a collision between it and a Chinese jet that was sent up to intercept, and so it was forced to land, and so that was one instance, and then just last June, Trudeau complained that the Chinese were harassing Canadian jets who were flying over the coastline of China and North Korea, spying. What else would they do there? And the Americans, were crying the same tune, saying that the Chinese jets were coming too close, to American jets. So, and let's not forget the warships, the Canadian warships and the American warships that routinely sail through the Taiwan Strait. And in the Indochina policy, the new Indochina policy, The defense minister is saying that they've increased the number of frigates who would be doing this kind of action from 2 to 3. So by a 50% increase. So there you have it. I mean, this shows the irrationality of the reaction. I think the Colombian government reacted quite rationally when a similar balloon flew over that country, and they stated that the object was no threat to national security, and it was no threat to the safety of aviation or the safety of people on the ground. And so that was the only statement that they made. And the balloon, I think today or yesterday, glided, peacefully and non-threateningly out of Colombian airspace. So I think, it wasn't a coincidence that there were 2 balloons, up in the sky at the same time. And it leads me to conclude that these are probably weather balloons launched by a private Chinese company who are trying to, I guess, gather meteorological data in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. I mean, a lot of countries do that at the same time, and so that is my plausible explanation. And in terms of surveillance, even the Americans stated they don't know how much more information that these balloons can get that they don't already have from satellites. But I think what's happening today is that Biden and the political instability in the U.S. Has forced the Republicans have forced Biden to take a tough stand, and so they decide to, hey, let's shoot down this balloon. It doesn't cost us anything, but that's not true. Shooting down this balloon cost the Americans $500,000. $400,000 for the AIM-9X missile, and the F-22 plane that was sent up to launch the missile. The operating cost is $68,000 per hour. So I don't know how many hours he was up there, but it's at least $500,000 that it cost the Americans to shoot down this balloon. So there you have it. And then Canada, like you mentioned, summons the Chinese ambassador, in Ottawa, and I don't know why, except maybe the ambassador will explain to them why the balloon flew over Canada for at least 1 to 2 days, and the Canadians never said anything about that for those couple of days, until somebody in Montana looked up in the sky and said, hey, there's a balloon up there. And then the Americans started making a big deal out of it. And so I guess Canada, I don't know, again, they overreacted. But at the same time, the Americans have not summoned the Chinese ambassador in Washington, but Canada has. And so I can conclude by saying that I think that Canada has become the new attack dog for the Americans, replacing Australia, with the new Australian Labor government undergoing an attitude adjustment, and they're trying to play nice with China in order to improve their relationship economically and politically with China. Canada has stepped in to be the new running dog, or I should say attack dog of the Americans.
Yeah, I should say that there was a story. Apparently, in 1998, Canada actually had a similar type balloon that got lost, and it ended up over Britain and into over the Scandinavian countries. There was a story about that I saw earlier today. So this history of these balloons sort of, being lost or kind of losing control is apparently that happens somewhat regularly. The joke you made about TikTok is interesting, because a few weeks ago there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about how in a bunch of Republican states in the US, they've begun banning TikTok on public Wi-Fi. And the story was about students at universities, public universities, who can't access TikTok when they're on campus through the data, through the university's sort of Wi-Fi. And so there really is a pretty crazy kind of anti-China politics sweeping the U.S. The New York Times business section had this story a couple of days ago about North Dakota, where I think maybe it's Grand Forks. There was this corn mill that was the government, both the state government, the city had agreed to these subsidies for. There was big investment, gonna set it up. It was a Chinese firm, and then it got caught in this sort of like anti-China backlash to the point where the Air Force put out a statement that this corn mill was a security threat to the U.S. or to the. There's a base, I guess, there's an Air Force base somewhere in the vicinity of the city in North Dakota, and they actually got it shut down. This is like a corn mill. So there's a real talk about banning TikTok in the U.S. They say about a third of all Americans actually use TikTok, just because it's a Chinese-owned company. So there really is, and there's a whole bunch of stories in the business press about the campaign the Americans are waging to convince other countries to not sell semiconductors, chips, and the high tech to China. And so it really is a big, major diplomatic, effort. The U.S. is putting pressure on all kinds of Netherlands, obviously Taiwan, other countries to follow their really is a war, an economic war. I mean, I don't think it has to be understood as an effort to undermine, stunt, whatever you want to call it, China's economy. So,
well, who actually pays for these policies? For the policies of the warmongers, the American people, and I would have to say, American teenagers are going to pay for having TikTok banned, because they're going to be very upset about that. And the people in the Dakotas, they're going to be losing out on 400 jobs. The Chinese plant was going to set up to I don't know what they do, but it's to produce cornmeal, I believe, and they were slated to have 400 permanent, well-paying jobs, and that's why the local government and the state government at the beginning endorsed this project until the warmongers started raising this objection. So it's actually the American people who will pay. The Taiwanese people will pay, because their computer chip manufacturing company, TSMC, was forced to move and set up the largest plant in Phoenix, Arizona, by the Americans with all kinds of subsidies. So I think we need to say this, that the people will definitely be paying for this warmongering of the American government.
Yeah, but so in terms of Canada's role in the whole economic decoupling, do you have any thoughts or comments on that? On Canada's role in some of that?
Well, I think Canada's going against the trend. Because Xi Jinping and the Chinese government have done a pretty good job in terms of their soft power and turning around the hostility that was, I guess, generated during the pandemic, principally by the Americans, by the Australians. But now the Australians have left behind the hostile policies of the Scott Morrison government, and now they're entering into various negotiations with China for trade agreements, whereas Canada is going the opposite direction. The new Indo-China policy directly attacks China as, how did they put it? It's an increasingly disruptive power. I think they used the word disruptive. They haven't used the word hostile or anything else like that yet. And so the trade with China has been decreasing over the last couple of years. China is the second largest economy in the world, and it's the second trading partner with Canada. But Canada is willing to give up all that for the sake of ideology. And again, Canadian people will be paying for that as well, because they're limiting any Chinese investment into companies here, Huawei, ZTE, in terms of electronics, resource companies, and so the Canadian people will be paying with losing jobs. So the only thing I can say on that is, Canada is really going against the trend, and it's ending up on the wrong side. It's ending up on the wrong side in terms of trying to decouple itself from China, and for what purpose? You got to ask the Canadian government, for what purpose are you decoupling yourself from China, other than for ideological purposes?
Yeah, one of our friends of Canadian foreign policy, Bhagwat Sandhu, has a piece he sent me. I think it's going to appear in the Hill Times today or tomorrow, because Melanie Joly is in India right now, and she's sort of trying to kind of break India from China and Russia, for that matter. That sort of, and in his piece, he points out that in fact, trade between India and China is just growing, even while India is being sort of trying to bring India into this sort of U.S. alliance targeting China. The actual trade between India and China is growing at 12.5% per year over the past 7 years or something like that. And just so, quite impressive kind of numbers. And yet, what would Melanie Joly have to offer the Indian, as much as the Indian government may have its, border disputes with China and have certain reasons for why it would join a campaign, when it comes down to simple economics, that it wouldn't really make sense. But now, final question, just before opening up to people, because we're actually close to the 7 o'clock, is that, so that U.S. general, 4-star general, Monahan, or I don't know how you pronounce the guy's name, but he said that they expect to be at war by 2025, which is 2 years from now, and presumably that's over Taiwan. And we see all these stories. Americans signed an agreement Thursday or Wednesday with Philippines for 4 more bases. CNN has this report, and more related, some stuff with India, a new base in Guam, Marine base in Guam. They are building up. You got Japan massively increasing its military spending, specifically citing China. And you sort of, what are your thoughts on this war, potential war in Taiwan, and all this sort of geopolitics of that?
Yeah, I think what the Americans are trying to do is what they did with Russia just before the Ukraine war, because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, saying that China is getting ready to invade Taiwan, and that the U.S. will go to war with China. I don't think that's going to happen, because the U.S. is at war with Russia, but they haven't set foot. They haven't put boots into the Ukraine. The Ukrainian people has become the cannon fodder for the Americans, and I think, unfortunately, if war breaks out in Taiwan, it'll be the Taiwanese people that's going to be cannon fodder. But I don't think that's going to happen. The reason why I don't think that's going to happen is because the Chinese people are very patient. The Chinese government, the government of the People's Republic of China, is very patient. They've waited 70 years. I mean, to reunite with Taiwan. I think they can wait another 70 years. They're going to rely on peaceful reunification. They have everything going for them. They have family ties, they have cultural ties, people relations, and then eventually integrating the economies. The reunification will happen by itself. They don't need to go to war. But, and it's a big but, if the Americans keep egging on the Taiwanese government, the DPP, towards independence. This is where the possibility of hostility will come in. And if this general has a crystal ball and say, well, the Taiwan government is going to declare independence in 2025, then of course, that's a different ballgame. But there was some good news today that came out of Taiwan today. The vice chairman of the opposition party, the Kuomintang, is going to China, going to the mainland China, starting this coming Wednesday, and he'll be there for a 10-day visit. He'll be talking with Chinese officials, Taiwanese who are living in China, and I think this is the way that this peaceful reunification will take place. Just one last word on this. I think what the Americans are trying to do is establish a one China, one Taiwan policy, because they've gone beyond one China policy. They've given that up, quite a while ago. So it's one China, one Taiwan, and that one Taiwan they want is a vassal to the American empire. They want an independent Taiwan, so that they can have that to encircle China, and that's why they're spending so much money. I think since 2010 they've spent $25 billion in armaments, and in the new American military budget of $858 billion, $10 billion of that budget will be allocated to Taiwan to strengthen the military, and that is written into the bill itself. And so you can see how the Americans are politically, economically, and militarily preparing the Taiwanese people for the possibility of war with the mainland.
Okay, go ahead, Yuri.
Thanks, Eve, and thanks, William. Great as always. Eve, didn't you once ask us, like, shouldn't the NDP just get rid of their foreign affairs? Their foreign affairs critics. It sounds to me, given Heather McPherson's background and given the history of the NDP, yes, I think the NDP should just, get rid of their foreign affairs. I'd rather that the NDP, just focus on domestic affairs and not care about foreign policy if they're only going to add more fuel to the Canadian imperial fire. But I wanted to ask, but also, William, I actually want to challenge you on something. I don't think we should be optimistic about the new Australian Labor government, because the Labor Party is, in Australia is also a pro-imperialist, pro-settler, colonial, friendly capitalist party, and the World Socialist website, which does a lot of really great reporting on Australian and Kiwi affairs. This new Anthony Albanese, I think he's also going to be very hostile towards China. And when the time comes, heaven forbid, that war does escalate, he will definitely be all in with USA, and so forth. But given all of that, and given this ridiculous balloon affair in which so many people are recycling the propaganda, and there's just so many people that are just that just think that we should confront China and so forth, are you optimistic that, heaven forbid, shit hits the fan and things escalate, that there's going to be at least a robust peace movement, however small, to push back against it, or not so optimistic on that?
Are you talking to me?
But yes. Yourself and Eve as well.
Okay. You're absolutely right. Australia is an imperialist power. Australia is a racist country. So I have no illusions. But what I'm saying is, in the bigger geopolitical situation today, Australia has now, I guess, put a muzzle on itself as the chief running dog of the U.S., and they've passed that role over to Canada. And Melanie Joly, Justin Trudeau, they may not be as sharp as Scott Morrison was, but they are trying to play that role as the barking attack dog for the U.S. empire. So I just want to make that point. And after making that point, I've absolutely forgotten what your question was.
If this situation gets any worse, like with this ridiculous balloon affair, are you optimistic that the anti-imperialist movements, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in at least Britain, because the peace movement is really of non-existent in Europe. Are you optimistic though that the peace movement, whether it's in Canada, the US, Australia, and Britain, will mobilize itself to push back against against whatever comes next with the pivot to Asia?
Yeah, in the long run, I'm very, very optimistic. In the short term, we have a lot of obstacles that we have to overcome. And as Eve pointed out, the NDP, the Green Party, these false gods of leftism and human rights or whatever, because they've been able and they're still able to attract a lot of attention. This motion that was passed, private members bill that was passed, as Eve mentioned last week, once again, repeating that China has committed genocide against the Uyghurs, and asking the Canadian government to find 10,000 imaginary Uyghur refugees to come to Canada. I mean, this was supported by Heather Ferguson and Jamit Singh and the NDP. The only person of note from the NDP that did not vote for this motion was Ashton, because she did not show up. She wasn't there, and so I guess that was her way of voting against this motion. But she was the only person of note on the left, that so-called left, that did not go along with that motion, but everybody else did.
Yeah, I actually meant to mention this before, honestly. Heather, 2 months into it, Heather McPherson, NDP foreign critic, has not said anything about Peru. So despite 60 people being killed, despite mass protests, blockades, and almost entirely indigenous people, huge Canadian mining interests, Canadian government heavily, backing the Boluarte, nothing from McPherson yet, 2 months in. And that, I just make a plug that tomorrow night there's going to be a Canadian uprising in Peru that if anyone's interested, I'll be speaking at that and a few other people. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. I mean, this is just, when you hear whether it's Russia, China, and the things that they ignore, like in South and Central America and Haiti and all that, this is just more, neo-colonial, neo-imperialist propaganda. We talk about misinformation, disinformation, the mainstream media, but maybe the thing to do is to push that this is just more propaganda, and look at the historical examples. There's a book, I think again, it's called Seeing Red, A History of Natives in Canadian Newspapers. And it goes on, how they've been portrayed, demonized, villainized. So, the imperialists can keep going west and taking more native land, and this is the same sort of thing. So I don't know if you can make a connection with the historical context of that sort of propaganda, that the mainstream media is just a lapdog for the imperialists and what's going on today, and maybe somehow reach out to natives in Canada and in Central and Latin America with their struggles and how they've been ignored or demonized. And it's the same thing that's going on with China and Russia. And the other thing, you talked about that American general, and I think one of his arguments that he's predicting that this will be this conflict is because there's an election coming up in 2024 in Taiwan, but America will be distracted by the presidential election going on. But I think in 2024, isn't there also the Ukrainian election? And would that have a role in what's going on? Because I mean, I don't know where Zelensky stands in the polls, but he's canceled so many political parties that would there be anybody actually to run in against him in that election? And I guess that's sort of it, yeah.
Do you have any response, William?
I guess this American general, it just shows the American-centric point of view. Just because there's an election in 2024, there will be a war in 2025. I mean, that's a very self-centered way of looking at the world, but that's the way the Americans do it. And I guess if Trump gets reelected in 2024, he may start a war in Taiwan. Who knows?
Yeah, and just on the media side to it, yeah, I mean, I think that the dominant media is an articulation and represents the power structure in society, right? And so the fact that they have been deeply tied to the whole colonial process and justifying dispossession of First Nations, and then similarly with justifying imperialism, Canadian imperialism, or U.S. empire's global domination is sort of, it's par for course. It's a way of figuring out how we can build the consciousness outside of the dominant media institutions to push back against it. And there are many examples over history of that succeeding, right? It usually takes years or decades of struggle and campaigning and building political institutions and demonstrations and books and articles and events and but it's possible, and that's in large part what we're trying to do here with the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. It's already past 7 o'clock, so unless there's any other questions, I'd like to thanks William for coming on, and certainly we'll get back in touch. Unfortunately, the deterioration of Canada-China relations is probably going to pick up steam in the coming months. So there's probably going to be many opportunities to revisit some of this terrain. But thanks everyone for coming out, and same place, same time next week. Take care, everyone. Good night. Good night.